welcome to episode 259 of the Daily Fantasy Edge. My name is Adam Levitan. I, of course, am one of the analysts here at DraftKings. I'm the father of the most beautiful beast in the world, Jerry. And today, we continue our NFL draft series. This is a young man who follows college football as close as anyone, I believe, on the planet. A young man with a true Midwest/Minnesota beard. Looks like he's ready to go ice fishing as we speak. It's the reigning college football fantasy writer of the year, Thor Nystrom of RotoWorld. Thor, what's going on?
Not a lot, man. Such an honor to be with you. And man, we've actually hit draft week. It's Monday. Like I woke up this morning, I'm like, my God, 3 more days. We're here.
Yeah, we're just 3 days away from the draft, as Thor mentioned. I'm actually heading to Boston on Wednesday to appear on the DKTV draft show. We're finally going to get landing spots for these guys, which I think is very, very exciting from a fantasy perspective. I'm still working on getting myself up to speed on who these prospects are, their talent level, how early they can contribute. And I think that's where Thor can help a lot. But landing spots are obviously going to be a huge, huge thing to look at. By the way, we hit on running backs and tight ends last week with Hayden Winks. We're going to do wide receivers and quarterbacks today with Thor. One thing that I do, or I think, I don't know if this is true, I think that Hayden and Thor have very different approaches to how they scout college players. Hayden, if you listened last week, is almost strictly data and analytics when it comes to evaluating prospects. Thor, I know, is watching college football all day, all night, 7 days a week. Thor, why don't you tell the people a little bit more about your process on how you evaluate prospects?
Yeah, that's a great summation. I think that's fair. You know, Hayden and I do come from different perspectives. I would say that for me, my approach is holistic. You know, when I look at this stuff, like I love Hayden's stuff. I love the other analytics stuff out there that I can get my hands on. I mean, I read all kinds of analytics stuff because, you know, it's like the, you know, learn from the past or you're doomed to repeat it kind of a thing. And I think that data is speaking to something, is pointing us at something. So I think it has to be baked in. You know, and then also, as you mentioned, I watch an absurd amount of college football live, you know, during the season, covering it. You know, also watch tape afterwards. You know, I look at all the PFF metrics. I'm really big with that too. And so, you know, I just try to bake in as much information as possible, background information, you know, like looking into the Jeffrey Simmons tape or, you know, looking into different like contextual things. You know, I just try to read as much as I can. And so I just accrue all of this information. And then I spend a lot of time writing. And basically during my writing process is where I sort of learn what I think about these guys. You know, it's just sort of like gathering all this kindling on each guy, you know, like going through that process, doing the work. And then you sit down to write it and you just sort of set it ablaze and see where it takes you and stuff like that. And then, you know, you stack the board, and I'm in the process right now. I think I'll be done today stacking my top 400 board. I have all my position rankings done and everything like that. So it's a hell of a process, and I get to spend 4 or 5 years with all three with some of them, but I get to spend multiple years with these kids, you know, from their recruiting process all the way through. So this is sort of like my, you know, writing my goodbye letters, you know, to these guys, and then, you know, you wave them goodbye, and Evan and Pat Doherty and, you know, Ray and Lord Reeves and all those guys, they take them over from there, and I jump to the 2020 guys.
Wow, I've never heard anybody say it like that. You feel like you have a bond with these kids just from writing about them. I'm curious, you said you're going to have top 400. I assume that includes offensive linemen, defensive linemen, etc.
Yep.
How can you, when you watch a game, evaluate offensive line live? It seems like that'd be really difficult to do without going back and watching.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And you have to with that, you know, with a position like that. You know, it's just about, you know, evaluation. It's like, you know, in any metric, in any different thing that you're evaluating, you know, whether it's, you know, like financial options or, you know, relationship option, you know, whatever. You have to know your strengths and your weaknesses and stuff like that. And, you know, with the skill guys, specifically the quarterbacks, tight ends, running backs, most of those guys I have, you know, I can watch them in my head, you know, from all the times that I watched them in college. With guys like offensive line, you know, I got to go back, you know, and I also have, that's a part where that holistic thing comes in, where I have to lean on some other things a bit more, you know, that the analytics can show us stuff like that. There's specific writers that I think do a really good job with offensive line. And so it's, it's a bunch of different stuff like that, looking at their PFF grades, stuff like that, and then going back into their film, and stuff like that. So yeah, that's one of the positions where you do have to grab more from the outside. Whereas like with quarterback or running back, some of those guys, I will go on my intuition above anything else, just because I have such a strong gut feel. Some of those other positions, I have to lean on other parts of the process just a bit more.
All right, enough nonsense. Let's get to these prospects here, Thor. The first wide receiver that I want to talk to you about is one I wasn't aware of any mock drafts, any projections, and I was just looking at this guy and I was like, holy cow, this guy has red flags all over the place. He's coming off of Liz Frank injury, which is one of the most serious injuries a player can have. He's only 166 pounds. At the combine, he played in an offense in college, which was the most explosive offense we've seen. Marquise Brown, to me, has red flags all over the place, but everybody's saying he's still going to go in the first round. Is Marquise Brown worth a first round pick in your eyes?
It's very, very close. For me, he is right on that cut line. I rank him as the third receiver behind Hakeem Butler and N'Keal Harry. You mentioned the Liz Frank thing. That is pretty troubling for a guy whose game is all athleticism, speed, agility, agility at high speeds and stuff like that. So that is troubling. He missed his pre-draft process. I'm not as concerned about that because he was going to test his a ludicrous athlete. I mean, he was saying beforehand, and I believe him on this. I don't think this was hubris. He was saying if he wasn't injured, he was going to threaten the combine record for 40, and his 3-cone was going to be stupid and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not as concerned by that. Your point is well taken, though, that there are red flags there. I just think, for me, I agree with the Deshaun Jackson comp, assuming he comes back fully healthy, which again is another red flag there. There are just a lot of other receivers here at the top that I might have a little bit more questions about, like DK Metcalf would be one. So yeah, I mean, I like Hollywood. Hollywood can play.
Yeah, I get worried about chasing outliers, right? People say, oh, well, Tyreek Hill is small or Deshaun Jackson is small. And these guys are massive outliers to everybody else. If you look at all the prospects who are under 170 pounds or 5'9" or whatever, the vast majority of them fail. Look at John Ross already seems to be, I'm not giving up on John Ross, but he already seems to be on his way to being in big trouble as an NFL prospect. It just seems to me when you're chasing outliers with a first round pick with a Liz Frank injury, you're asking for trouble, especially with, as you mentioned, so many ridiculous size speed athletes in this draft. But I could easily be proven wrong. I understand that his tape is ridiculous.
The John Ross, that is a great point, Adam. Tremendous to bring that up. It's, where for me with Hollywood, where the league is going, is a part of the reason why I do give him a slight bump there. On tape, he does look like Jackson from back in Cal, and fortunately enough for Hollywood, he happened to find this perfect situation for him. I don't know how he's going to come back from that foot, and I don't know how his body's going to hold up in the NFL. But as far as being a speed and space player, a guy that can break ankles at high speeds, he's got stupid speed. Like the speed where like in the stadium, like everyone gets quiet and you start to hear it, like a sonic boom kind of a thing. Crazy athleticism. But yeah, your point is well taken with the red flags. I think that's fair.
All right, let's move on to Hakeem Butler. There's kind of what I've noticed is a dichotomy or a big separation between kind of fantasy Twitter and draft Twitter versus the real NFL guys with Hakeem Butler. 6'5", 227, just absolutely huge. Showed an ability to play in the slot, which I thought was encouraging. Huge market share of Iowa State's pass game production, which we always love. Why is there such a disconnect between what seems like the NFL and kind of the analytics / Twitter community on Hakeem Butler?
Well, I think coming into this season, the NFL was low on Hakeem. Hakeem had never been a wide receiver one before. He was behind Lazard. I think the NFL missed on him coming into this season. So I think they started out behind. The scouting, companies like Blesto and stuff like that were lower on Hakeem. And at the time, it made sense. We'd never seen Hakeem as the wide receiver one. We didn't know how he was going to do or if he was even going to get that target share that you were talking about. But he did. And then he came out and he tested like a ridiculous athlete. He dominated, sort of on the smaller stage with Iowa State, sort of out of that Big 12 spotlight. But as you mentioned, Hakeem was the only receiver on the team. You know, Iowa State was a team with a mediocre true freshman quarterback. You know, they had to bench their veteran, this fifth year senior named Kyle Kempt. They had to bench him. They go to this Brock Purdy kid. He's got a noodle for an army. You know, he's a decent player, but and he underthrew Hakeem all the time, and left all sorts of yards out there. They had a terrible offensive line. David Montgomery was the only other offensive player they really had. The other receivers were terrible. And so they were basically just, all the targets were just going Hakeem's way. They played him in the slot. That's you mentioned that's something Iowa State likes to do. That's what they did with Lazard. And a part of that is to mask the awful offensive line and the mediocre quarterback play. Just sort of take the free yards where you can, try to move the chain, stuff like that. And then Hakeem also got to play on the outside, both because in 2017, Lazard was predominantly playing the slot. And then, this year they got to mix and match with him. I think Hakeem is a guy that can do a lot of different things. He was a guy whose development was held back. He had a very strange high school career. He sort of came from poverty in Maryland, and a lot of misfortune. His mom passed away and stuff like that, and he had to move to Texas midway through his high school career. He just didn't have anywhere else to go. Moved in with his cousins, the Harrison twins, that went on to play at Kentucky in the NBA. And the Texas high school folks decided to suspend Hakeem Butler for half his junior year because they said he was transferring for athletic reasons. So he started behind the eight ball there. He was on a team that had Steven Sims, who went on to be Kansas's number one receiver. So they were sort of splitting the targets. He got overlooked. And he was very, very raw when he went to, Iowa State. They sort of took a flyer on him, and they had to build him up, and they did. And this year, man, he really took off. 2017 was the first time he got extended field time. Did really well. I think in a secondary role for how raw he was. And then this year, he was still super duper raw. And I think that's what people need to keep in mind. This kid was crazy raw. It's sort of like the Lamar Jackson thing last year. As far as the quarterback class, you can't view. You couldn't view at the time Lamar Jackson in terms of polish the same way you could with Josh Rosen. It was just different situations, and that's a part of it with Hakeem. And then so I think to answer your question with specifics, I think the NFL started out way behind him. Mm-hmm. I don't think they understand the context of his situation. And then the last thing I would say is the one truly troubling thing about Hakeem Butler's evaluation is the drop rate. I don't have the number right in front of me, but it's something like 16 point something was his drop rate last year, which is super duper troubling. Don't get me wrong. But the hands as appendages, there's no issue with them. Hakeem Butler makes just ludicrous catches. He does drop routine balls, but he also dropped balls where no other receiver they would have counted as a drop. It's like the thing in baseball with Ozzie Smith back in the day was had ridiculous range, and he'd get to balls that other shortstops wouldn't even try for, and they'd give him errors when he couldn't make the play or whatever. That's sort of like Hakeem. He's got a catch radius of like an Indian god, like just ridiculous. He gets up in the air, he levitates, stuff like that. And so he was getting to balls that other guys weren't. And that thing, and then also he had, as you mentioned, you go back to the target share thing. Hakeem Butler had to do everything for Iowa State this past season. I mean, they did not have anyone else, and outside of Montgomery, obviously. And so, when this true freshman with the noodle arm was throwing downfield, Butler had to do everything to go and get that ball. And you saw times where there was a famous play against Kansas where I was watching this live because I'm a Kansas alum. The Hakeem Butler just burned everyone downfield. It was a free touchdown. All you got to do is throw a lollipop up at 6 points. The freshman quarterback underthrows him by 20 yards. This ball lands at the 20. Hakeem Butler just throws on the brakes, furiously works his way back, jumps over the defensive back, catches the ball over his shoulder, reels it in, chucks the guy aside, sprints into the end zone, breaks tackle, stuff like that. I just think the guy's a freak, and I think a lot of his drops are both attributed to the fact that he was super raw, that he had to do everything, and all that sort of stuff. I think technical, I think when he gets the polish, when he's learned his position more, when he doesn't have to do everything, I think those things are going to be mitigated. And he's also one of the great downfield threats that we've seen the past decade or so of college football. He finished number one in every PFF downfield metric despite his drop rate. Yeah. Right. So like if that had gone down by 10%, I mean, just think of what would have happened.
Yeah, I'm rarely worried about drops. A lot of the best receivers in the NFL have high drop rates. It just kind of comes with the territory. I would not be worried about it whatsoever. Drops are always an issue for wide receivers until they aren't. It's not a very sticky stat from year to year. One guy that I think is going to go ahead of Hakeem Butler on Thursday night, and maybe a lot of people think he shouldn't, is DK Metcalf. And I would assume that a lot of people's first impression of DK Metcalf was like on Twitter, seeing this picture of him shirtless, just like full out team sex, like outrageous picture. Looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think by now people who are following it close understand more of the full picture, that DK Metcalf's lateral testing was pretty pathetic in the shuttle and the 3-cone. And that kind of jives with what a lot of the tape people say, that he only plays outside, he only runs a couple routes, et cetera, et cetera. Should DK Metcalf be going ahead of Hakeem Butler, and is DK Metcalf worth a first-round pick?
No and no. I didn't really get the hype beforehand. I mean, because he is like at Ole Miss, he just was the one-trick pony guy. You know, I mean, we already knew that he was really big. We already knew he was cut. We already knew that, you know, with lesser talented cornerbacks, he could pop, you know, he could blow by him and pop the top off. But this is a kid who never did work in the intermediate sector at Ole Miss. You talk about a kid, he would, you know, people think about this out there. DK Metcalf was in an air raid system for 3 years of college. He got to play with 3 different quarterbacks who might play in the NFL, and yet he did not have 70 catches over his entire career, right? You know, and this is a guy also who was shut down against, you know, the better cornerbacks that he faced. Greedy Williams from September is a great example of this. DK was absolutely shut down, and he was bullied too by a guy who's like 40 pounds lighter than he is. You know, what DK can do is the pop the top off thing. You know, in terms of size, speed, it's ridiculous. He can get downfield and stuff like that. But cornerbacks that can't be beat by speed, they give them real trouble. You know, Greedy's a great example, because Greedy basically dared DK to beat him in the intermediate sector. And, you know, DK, he's so labored, you know, with the side-to-side agility. You mentioned it. It showed up in Indianapolis, where he telegraphs it. You know, it's like a pitcher who like, you know, he tips off the pitch in advance. And so Greedy was just, every time DK tried to throw a curveball, like, oh, we're not going to go deep this time, I'm not going to give you the heat, you know, whatever. You know, DK just, you know, sort of hung one over the plate, and Greedy just blasted it. So, you know, for a team that is looking for that, you know, I think DK does offer some stuff, but for me, he's the wide receiver 5. You know, I have him below AJ Brown, I have him below Hollywood, and the 2 other guys we talked about. So yeah, I'm a little bit lower on him than the consensus for sure.
Yeah, if you read my article on DK Playbook about the minimum thresholds for elite wide receivers, I mean, a lot of these guys are just smashing all the thresholds because this class is so ridiculous athletically. DK Metcalf missed on obviously the minimum threshold for the lateral testing, which I think is a pretty big concern. Speaking of DK Metcalf, his teammate AJ Brown was actually more productive. He is not getting the same kind of hype that DK Metcalf is getting, presumably because he didn't test as athletically. But it seems to me that AJ Brown looks like a better prospect. He's drawn some Juju Smith-Schuster comparisons from what I've seen, because neither of them, Juju or AJ Brown, tested that well in the 40 or in the broad. Do you see any Juju in AJ Brown's game, and who do you like between DK and AJ Brown?
Yeah, I do. I love that comp. And I prefer AJ Brown. I mean, AJ, like you mentioned, AJ Brown was better than DK by margin his entire career. You know, all 3 years they spent together there. DK's got a lot of work to do to catch up to AJ Brown, you know, to not even speak about passing him. I don't know if he can get there. Obviously they're different kind of players. AJ Brown, you know, he's kind of like a wonky player. And I think, like, you know, before he tested, it was easy to sort of nitpick him and try to push him down the board. Like, there was a lot of guys on draft Twitter, I remember early in the fall, where it was like, you know, you'd see this stuff on Twitter where it'd be like, someone show me the tape where AJ Brown is good, and like all this kind of stuff. And it's just like, knock it off. Like, I seen this guy for the last 2 years in Oxford. He's a 4-star recruit. He's a top 5 overall receiver recruit. They were chucking that kid the ball from day one. You know, that he was getting all the targets. And you're talking about a team that had DK Metcalf, DeMarcus Lodge, Van Jefferson was there before, Dawson Knox. They had all these different guys. I'm probably forgetting a name or two as well. They had all these different guys, and all the targets from the jump went to AJ Brown. Now, he's not like, you know, he's a big slot, right? Like, he's basically like a guy who's like Leonard Fournette size, and nearly that athletic too. I mean, that was sort of the surprise for some people of his process, is that his spark score was I believe in the 76th percentile. But yeah, I mean, he's a big slot. He's extremely reliable, and there we have the proof of concept. I mean, he just shredded the SEC for 3 straight years. So he's going to translate as that. And then can he do stuff on the outside? Well, sometimes he did stuff on the outside at Ole Miss. I don't put it past him. I mean, he's an athletic kid. Love his toughness, love his quickness. Like I said, extremely reliable. The only thing, like, you wonder about like the contested catches and like stuff like that, and like getting downfield, as far as like he's got the movement and stuff to get down there, but he's only 6 feet. So I might keep him in the slot, but I think he's going to be a very, very good slot. And as you know, Adam, like the value of the slot is going up in the NFL year by year.
It's amazing. We've been talking for about 20 minutes now, and we still haven't gotten to another guy with just a ridiculous athletic profile. And that just shows how deep this wide receiver class, and that's N'Keal Harry. N'Keal Harry, I think one place where maybe the NFL has not adjusted yet is on age-adjusted production. I mean, as a 20-year-old true sophomore, N'Keal Harry had 82 catches, 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns. Then he was very productive again as a 21-year-old junior. Just a really big, strong athlete again. Why is N'Keal Harry not getting the same hype as maybe some of these other guys?
Yeah, so with him, the answer to that, it's the opposite side of the polarity as Hakeem Butler, where with N'Keal, he was like a 5-star, top all-world kind of recruit, ballyhooed and stuff like that. And he went to Arizona State. He had a couple of good years. And then, he was, one of those guys that was on top of those, too early 2019 look-aheads, when we did mock drafts and like rankings back last May. And I think he just really, really got nitpicked. He's an easy guy to nitpick because, he's a guy that doesn't create a ton of separation and stuff like that. He does have some sloppiness too, on his routes and stuff. He jaws at players, like stuff like that. And so I think it's easy to talk yourself out of him if you're inclined to do so. But the things he could do, like if we talk about what N'Keal Harry is, I think that N'Keal Harry is absolutely worth a first-round pick. I think he's basically the second coming of Dez Bryant. The body control, the ball skills with the with the ball in the air when it's coming down are incredible. His ball skills and his body control, down the sideline and in the air and stuff like that, are probably at the top of this class. And then a lot of the insinuation, from when he was getting nitpicked as far as the lack of separation, there was this sort of insinuation that he was not terribly athletic, like he was more an average athlete who is something of a plotter. That is that is incorrect. I mean, that's just categorically false. He's one of the more fun players in the class to watch when he's got the ball in his hands, and it's not just straight ahead. I mean, in fact, it's probably more pyrotechnics than it is like straight ahead using his power, although he does that too. He's a guy who reverses his field a lot. He's great, in traffic, picking his way through traffic. And he reminded me of Reggie Bush, when on end arounds or when, he'd get it at the sideline and he couldn't really, perceive a path forward there. And so he'd cut, reverse his field. I mean, he had some just, ridiculous, after the catch kind of runs in college. And he was also a fabulous punt returner at Arizona State. So he is a very athletic kid. And he came out and, he tested in the 75th percentile, which I think was better than some people thought. So yeah, I think he's going to be a really good NFL receiver. I mean, NFL receivers aren't, Adam, as we talk about this separation thing a lot because Hakeem Butler gets nitpicked for this too. But in the NFL, it's not like you don't see like guys that are like, have like this halo of separation around them all of the time. It's just about creating these sort of micro throwing window opportunities for your quarterback. N'Keal Harry is a guy who's very gifted at doing that.
Yeah. I think if this wasn't such an outrageous wide receiver class, there'd be more buzz around N'Keal Harry. And also same maybe can be said for this next guy we're going to talk about. When I saw Miles Boykin's measurables, I actually thought there was a mistake. I was like, we've never seen a human like this. I actually texted Josh Norris. I texted Evan Silva. I was like, what in the world is going on here? This guy's testing is just out of control. 6'4", 220, 4'4", 240, 43.5-inch vertical, which is just absurd. 140-inch broad, which is just absurd. 99.9th percentile spark score, best on record ever among wideouts. And then you go look at Miles Boykin's production in college, and it's, there's not that much there. He was okay last year. I'm sure there were reasons for that, which I don't know as someone who doesn't watch college football that closely. I think they had some quarterback concerns. I think they didn't throw the ball, obviously, as much as bunch of other teams at Notre Dame. But man, Miles Boykin, I think, is screaming up draft boards as we speak. Can you explain Miles Boykin's lack of college production and where you think he'll go or how you think he'll do in the NFL?
Yes, I can. The reason that his production was way down was because for a year and a half he had to work with Brandon Wimbush, who's a quote unquote dual threat quarterback, but he can't throw.
Mm-hmm.
So he's just a sort of scrambler. And I mean, Wimbush left yards on the field for everyone. It wasn't just Boykin in the last class; it was Equanimous. Alize Mack is another guy in this class who, Wimbush was a guy who was just like, it's like kind of like Nuke Lelouch. He was just like, hitting people on the sidelines, hitting people off their horses, stuff like that. And so like, yeah, I mean, he played down every receiver around him. And then, they switched to Ian Book the last half of this season. And I think that's why you started to see some of these guys' production go up a little bit. Like Ian Book's like, he's like a little scrambler. He's basically like a homeless man's like Doug Flutie. He's a little bit bigger, but like that's kind of what the thing is. And so he could actually shuttle the ball off to some of these guys. He couldn't throw it downfield, right? So he wasn't going to help Miles leverage his athleticism there either. So the short answer is they did not have anyone that had the arm to get the ball downfield. So like, Miles is special sauce sort of got wasted on that specific team. I do think that he's worth, a dart throw here. I have him wide receiver 9. I don't know where a lot of other people do, but I think right, and I have him ahead of for instance, Paris Campbell, Kelvin Harmon, Arcega Whiteside, so some guys that other people like quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think the measurables with the context, when you bake that in, it was not his fault that his numbers were down like that. He was not able to show that athleticism. I will say that like he is very raw, right? Like, his route running needs work. And he's got like this body of Adonis and he doesn't really use it very well. And so, he's got to be taught all that kind of stuff. Where is it going to go? We'll see. It is a risk. There is a risk profile there. But man, you're talking about an all-time athlete, elite size, length, athleticism, all that kind of stuff. So I think when the sure things are off the board, at that time, it's like if you want a receiver, I think it's time to ring up Miles because you might have something big there.
All right, let's move through some of these lower prospects a little bit quicker here. Paris Campbell is a guy with just an all-time low ADOT. Like all he did was run drag routes and catch the ball underneath for Ohio State, but he did test very well, just like everybody else in this class, but he did test very well. What do you think about Paris Campbell? And then we'll move on to another guy underneath in a second here in Andy Isabella. But I'm curious who you like between Paris and Isabella before we talk about him.
I prefer Isabella. I think Isabella can do way more things. Paris basically, I mean, for people at home, he's basically like a big Curtis Samuel. Like, is there stuff there? Sure. You can do stuff with him, but the guy categorically cannot catch the ball downfield. I think he had like 1 or 2 catches his entire career where the ball traveled more than 20 yards downfield. It is all stuff, horizontal or whatever. It's all screens and manufacturing touches for Paris and stuff like this. And then let's just see if he can run.
Yeah, I'm curious though because he has the athletic profile to go downfield. Was it maybe because Ohio State didn't use him going downfield, or because he definitely can't?
I think it's more the latter than the former. He's also a guy that, he's raw. He does not play well in traffic. He's not good around other bodies, and he doesn't really run routes at all. I mean, can you teach him all that stuff? Well, sure, but like we went through this with like a guy, for instance, like Curtis Samuel, where you try to talk yourself into it. Well, he's got the body, he's got the athletic profile, like different stuff like this. I think with Paris, you're talking about best case scenario, if this is just a bonanza and he hits his ceiling, then you got a Percy Harvin type. But I think more likely you're talking about a slightly bigger Curtis Samuel.
Okay, let's talk Andy Isabella then. Only 5'9", 188. I mean, insanely productive in college though. 102 catches last year, almost 1,700 yards, 13 touchdowns. But it was at UMass. Andy Isabella's analytics are just off the charts. A lot of people, I think Hayden had Andy Isabella as the number 1 analytics wide receiver. Can he be productive right away in the NFL? I know landing spot is going to be huge for Andy Isabella. Everyone wants him to be on the Patriots because he's a small white slot receiver, and everybody thinks that all these guys are going to the Patriots.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point there, because he does have to go to the right situation. He can't be misused. He's basically the exact same size as Wes Welker, but he, in my opinion, is not a slot receiver. He's an outside receiver. His special sauce is world class speed. He was a guy, people know this. He beat Denzel Ward twice in races in high school. Just an absolute burner. But yeah, he's used outside, and then that's sort of where his game is. It's more straight north south type explosive athleticism than it is sort of joystick type athleticism. And the other thing is, obviously the concern with Isabella is that, well, two of them, he's a body catcher, in addition to the size stuff, and then also his level of competition. But when I talked to you before about the holistic approach, Isabella is a guy where if you just focus on tape, he's a guy where you can start to nitpick the heck out of him. He's going to get jarred at the line, in the NFL, like when he's got to be outside, he's going to get pressed and he's going to be able to get off of that. And then he's going to be body catching and all this different kind of stuff. They're going to force him into more contested situations, like all this different kind of stuff. But when you look at the analytics, and you look at the PFF grades and different stuff like that, and then you think back to other guys who were sort of in that phylum that you had questions about, past 5-10 years or whatever, for instance, Cooper Kupp was a guy who got nitpicked the heck, coming out of Eastern Washington. And, at a certain point, I just sort of tossed my hands up because I seen the kid just shred NFL players when he played them. It wasn't obviously all the time, but, he got to play Wazoo a couple of times and, stuff like that in college, and he shredded them all. Same thing with Isabella. He ripped apart Georgia, this past season. He had some really good games, Mississippi State, I think. They did have a few games against, really good teams or whatever, and he ripped them up too. I wouldn't go as far as calling him, the number one receiver and stuff, because, on the other side of the holistic thing, you got to bake in the other stuff as well. I don't think 100% of Andy Isabella's game is going to translate. But yeah, I mean, I like the kid. I like the kid for what he is, and I think a smart team, if they use him correctly, is going to get a lot of value there. It's a very unorthodox profile, but I think there is value there if you don't try to pigeonhole him just based on his skin color and his size.
All right, let's move to quarterbacks. We can spend less time on quarterbacks because I think they won't have as big of a fantasy impact in year one typically, except for guys who can really run with the football, and that's usually a big exception to the rule with rookie quarterbacks. I mean, we have seen repeatedly quarterbacks who can run with the football become dominant in fantasy very early in their careers. And you can make a case that Kyler Murray is one of the best runners with the football we've seen coming out in a long time. Not only threw for 4,300 yards and 42 touchdowns last year at Oklahoma, ran for over 1,000 yards, 12 more touchdowns. By now, everybody should know, could have been the number one pick overall in baseball. Does have height concerns at 5'11", but I think maybe that's becoming more and more overrated as we move along. It seems like a foregone conclusion at this point that Kyler Murray will be the number one pick on Thursday night. Should he be the number one pick, and how do you see him faring year one in the NFL?
No, I do not think he should be the number one pick. And I've said this throughout. I think, it'd be an enormous mistake for Arizona. And heck, if another team wants to trade up into that slot, it'd be an enormous mistake for them too, because there's better players out there. And listen, Kyler is a good prospect. I don't want to dump on him, but this thing where everyone jumped in on him is clearly the best prospect in the draft. I'm just not there with it. He's a prospect we've never seen before. First up, obviously, you're talking 5'10", 207. He had one season in this just utterly ideal system for a player of his type at Oklahoma. And then also, he also had the baseball thing, and people, you can't just forget about that because it's a data point. Again, you have to think about everything. Kyler's a kid who went to Texas A&M to start with, struggled as a true freshman, got angry at the coaching staff because they were switching him and Kyle Allen back in the day, Kevin Sumlin, this is. And so Kyler decides to transfer, so then he, kicks it over to Oklahoma, and then he gets drafted and, gave his word to Billy Beane, signed the contract, everything like that, played one more season of football, and then he jumped out on baseball. And so I think he's a wishy-washy kid who, if he does not star or is at least an average starting quarterback in the NFL after his first, 3-4 years, I think you could see him go back to baseball. His risk profile to me is absurdly high. And I do understand, the sexiness of his profile. There are super sexy things, as far, you were talking about the running. As far as the running, I comp him to Devin Hester, like in the open field. Like, you'll see him go back, 12 yards behind the line of scrimmage during a play. Look at all five guys. He does read the full field, doesn't see anything he likes. He'll go back a couple, 5-6 yards. It's like, back when, we used to play like Tecmo football in the 90s. You didn't really know what you were doing. And you're like Randall Cunningham, and like, you're like, oh no, I don't know what to do. And you like run backwards for a little bit, and then you like reset, like, okay, can I find you one? He kind of does that. He plays the position like you play video games, sort of. And so, he's great as a runner. And as a passer, he's got the arm strength. We knew that from baseball. I mean, he was comped to Andrew McCutchen as a center fielder, a guy who would just wipe people out, in center field as far as that stuff. But he's still raw. He still can get fooled. He still fools himself sometimes. And the other thing is, well, I do not have questions about, obviously the athleticism. He could be one of the best, scramblers. He might be the best scrambler of all time. We'll see. And I don't have any questions necessarily about the arm strength either. I do have some about the accuracy. Kyler was a guy who, in this quarterback class ranked near the top in terms of the percentage of throws he had that required adjustments by his receivers. And why that should concern people a little bit is because he was in this wide open system behind, one of the top three or so offensive lines in college football. Three of the kids are in this draft with him. His receivers were awesome. We were talking about Hollywood before, and all that kind of stuff. And then his coach is a guy that the NFL just fetishizes. Lincoln Riley. He's one of the best play callers in the world. Not just in college. He's elite. And so what I think about with Kyler is he only got to start for 1 year. Heading into this year, his TDI and T ratio for his career was just about even. It's just from his time sort of struggling at A&M. He gets to play this 1 year in this ideal circumstance or whatever. I wonder if he had played, let's say on Louisville. Let's say he'd transferred to Louisville instead. Lamar Jackson goes to the NFL. Just like Baker goes to the NFL, vacates the thing. If Kyler had been playing on Louisville this past season, and all of his balls aren't pinpoint, or whatever, like, and he's playing behind a bad offensive line, are we talking about him as the first overall pick, right? Assuredly not. And so I just think, sometimes, like, I think the NFL or like, some stuff like this, I think they miss on the context of some of this stuff, and they maybe some of it doesn't, completely get thought all the way through. And so that's why I've been low on the Kyler at 1-1 talk. Later on in the first round, I'd be down. Yeah. I mean, I'd love to have that kid on my team as far as that goes. But yeah.
Yeah, I think what happens is, and maybe this is right or maybe it's wrong, but at a position like quarterback where it's so outrageously important, like so much of your team's success depends on the quarterback, that of course quarterbacks are going to get pushed up and guys with high ceilings are going to get pushed up on teams' board. And it's so hard to accurately scout them. Like, I'd rather take a chance on 10 quarterbacks and hope that I hit a home run with one or two of them than just be like, well, I'll wait till next year. And I'll try to find the exact one that I like, because who knows if I'm going to be right or not. I'd rather have a lot of pulls at the roulette wheel. I understand that the number one overall pick is a ton of equity, especially after you took Josh Rosen last year. I don't know. It's an interesting decision for sure. And I don't think Josh Rosen is dead by any means. I still think he still has a chance to be an actual good NFL quarterback. So it's interesting.
I like
for
Rosen
sure.
a lot.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Well, if you're not that high on Kyler Murray, maybe we should talk about Dwayne Haskins. Are you higher on Dwayne Haskins than Kyler Murray? I mean, Dwayne Haskins backed up JT Barrett, then went off in 2018, 50 passing touchdowns, 4,800 yards at Ohio State. You don't typically see that kind of stuff in the Big Ten, or maybe you do more recently, but still, Dwayne Haskins does lack mobility. So I think from a fantasy perspective, Kyler is the way better prospect from a fantasy perspective. But from real life, who do you prefer between Kyler and Dwayne Haskins?
I agree with everything you just said. Yeah, from a fantasy perspective, it's Kyler for me. In terms of real football, I slightly prefer Haskins. It's not like a huge discrepancy. In terms of my overall thing, they're going to be within probably 7 or 8 guys or whatever. But I do have Haskins as my QB1. I like the kid a lot. He did have to sit behind people at Ohio State because of circumstance, and a part of that was out of his control. I mean, Haskins wanted to go to Maryland. He's another kid who's from the Baltimore area or whatever, and then they fired the coach that he'd signed with Randy Edsall, and then he wanted Mike Locksley to be the coach, and Maryland went with DJ Durkin. It ended up being like a huge scandal and an enormous mistake that pushed Haskins late in the process to Ohio State, where he did have to wait his turn. And he developed, and like you said, this year he just went supernova. I love the kid's arm talent. He just you talk about Twitch a lot, as far as like edge guys and stuff like that, like their movement and stuff like that. Haskins has got it with his arm. It's like his shoulder sockets are like extremely generous. He's got like long levers. He goes over the top. He reminds me of like a guy like Dwight Gooden when he's like throwing a fastball down the seam. That his throws are always on the money. His accuracy to almost every sector of the field was near the top of the class. When you're looking through like the some of those advanced metrics with the guys who chart and stuff like that. And then Haskins is, I talked with Kyler where his percentage of throws that required adjustments by his receivers was very high. Haskins was absurdly low. I think it was less than half as much as the next guy, which I believe was Will Grier. And so in terms of accuracy, in terms of arm talent, in terms of all that stuff, he's just top notch. Like you said, the way that I put it is he runs like the field is made of pudding. He is immobile, but another thing I'll say, he's not going to run or anything like that. But I believe he had the highest accuracy percentage in this class outside of the pocket, which I think would surprise some people. But he's a kid, he keeps his eyes up and he always plays in control. It's like and the difference there is like with Drew Lock, for instance. Drew Lock's a guy who will leave the pocket and he also always keeps his eyes up. He doesn't want to run, so there's similarities there. But Drew Lock sort of starts to like, he gets like a hero complex and he gets like all juiced up and he just wants to chuck it downfield and he doesn't really care like if the guys, if Emmanuel Hall, if 3 guys are on him, he's going to chuck it up or whatever. Haskins always keeps his mind with him. There is some technical things, and field reading things that I want him to work on at the next level. But just as far as being a ball of clay, I really like him as a thrower. I think he's going to do a lot of damage, and I think there's a lot to work with there.
In the next tier, you mentioned Drew Lock, and we've heard a lot about Daniel Jones lately, kind of screaming up the board. We've heard him linked to the Giants as high as number 6 overall. In that next tier, it seems like the next 2 off the board will be Drew Lock and Daniel Jones. I mean, we know quarterbacks are going to be overdrafted. I haven't seen many people with first-round grades on these guys, but maybe they end up going in the first round anyways. Who do you prefer between Drew Lock and Daniel Jones, and do you think either one is even in the first-round conversation?
I prefer, and I'm in the minority here, the big minority. I prefer Daniel Jones by quite a bit. I have Daniel Jones as my quarterback 3. I have Lock as my quarterback 5. I have Will Grier in between them. Daniel Jones, he's a very interesting guy, and I understand why like a lot of the guys who do the draft work from the NFL side, why they're really low on him. And I also, of course, understand the analytics guys. I mean, my boy Hayden just absolutely hates his systems, hate Daniel Jones because the stats are not good. But, he's a guy where you need to bake context in, as well. Daniel Jones, people say this about Drew Lock, but it's actually true about Daniel Jones and not Drew Lock. They say the thing about the supporting cast thing. Well, Drew Lock got to play with at least 2 NFL receivers, probably 3 at Missouri, as well as the guy who's going to be the first tight end off the board in the next class, and all this different stuff. Whereas Daniel Jones, he didn't play with anybody. I mean, his offensive line was absolutely atrocious, and he never had any receivers whatsoever. Certainly no guys that could go downfield. In fact, it was funny, like I remember in September, in late August and stuff, I read a lot of Adam, this from being at Roto World, you got to read like a lot of stories from all around the nation, the beat writers, all this kind of stuff. And so I was reading these stories about how Duke finally had a deep threat for Daniel Jones. They finally have produced one. It was this kid named Aaron Young, and everyone was so excited Daniel was going to get to throw downfield this year and stuff like that. And in the first game, this young kid has a really good game, and then he gets injured. And it's like, oh, no, the one guy we thought could catch the ball down the field, he can't anymore. So, Daniel Jones was just always under duress. Like I said, terrible offensive line, and he didn't have anyone that could make any plays downfield. They also didn't have any running backs. I mean, Daniel Jones was in 5 receiver sets, a ton. And it was no fluke. Daniel Jones's coaching staff, specifically David Cutcliffe, people know was the mentor for both the Mannings. He's the quarterback whisperer. He's not putting Daniel Jones in positions, not to succeed or whatever. And I think, the lack of deep ball game, so people that don't really know about Daniel Jones, I'll give you the quick cliff notes on him. He's a big athletic kid. In terms of running, you could see some Josh Allen type value with that thing. In college, he was awesome in the short game. He was awesome in the intermediate sector. And his deep ball game was utterly non-existent. And so he's this extremely wonky kind of profile where it basically comes down to one question. Did Daniel Jones not complete balls downfield because his supporting cast was so awful? It's plausible. It's a bit more than plausible. Or did he do it because he does not have touchdown field? He does not have a howitzer. He does have average arm strength. I mean, we've seen him push the ball down the field. He can do it. But is it a lack of touch? And the other thing I'll say, because I never see this when I read about Daniel Jones, and it stuns me because it's such important context. Daniel Jones broke his collarbone in September. He broke it like in the second or the third game, and we thought he was going to be out. I mean, I thought he was going to be out basically through like November. I was like writing the obituary on Duke's season and stuff like that, and he came back like 2 weeks later. And there was like all these crazy stories out at Duke about how some of those geniuses down there in the lab were doing like 3D printing and like stuff like this. Like you picture Daniel Jones down there, it's like Westworld and stuff like that. They're doing like the whole thing and all this kind of stuff. So he goes back, a couple of weeks later with this broken collarbone or whatever, and he's back out there behind this crappy offensive line with no receivers to throw to, and he's still doing work in the intermediate sector. He's still a tough kid who's going out there and running. There is it's like Hakeem Butler. There is this one enormous question in Daniel Jones's profile. If that thing does not get fixed, yeah, Daniel Jones is going to bust. I mean, if he can't throw downfield, he's 85% of what Ryan Tannehill is probably what he would be or whatever. But if he can get that thing, if he can start to, force the defense back, well, he's good enough at running and he's good enough in the short and intermediate sector that he's going to start to provide a puzzle for defense. He's going to start to become dangerous. So I like him a little bit more. As far as Drew Lock, I'm crazy low on Drew Lock. I have been throughout. He's a kid, in college, he never did anything against good defenses. He's a guy who rips up terrible defenses, and when they would play the good ones, he would always play down. His TDI&T ratio against good teams, I think I ran like the splits or whatever. It was against Power 5 teams that made a bowl game and Group of 5 teams that won 9 or more games. Drew Lock's TDI&T ratio for his career was just about even. And his record was like 6-24 or something like that. And then against the bad teams, his TDI&T ratio was like 62-6. It's just something stupid, and they won every game or whatever. So his stats just cratered against any good team. And what people out there need to understand is, because I got some stuff when I'd say this on Twitter, like, oh, that happens with everyone. No, it doesn't. Actually, if you look at, like, for instance, Pat Mahomes, who was a guy who Drew Lock drew absurd comps to earlier in the process. When you look at, like, Pat Mahomes, you run the same sort of thing on his stats at Texas Tech. Pat Mahomes actually played a little bit better against the good teams than he did the bad teams. You don't really see this with guys who become NFL stars, where their play consistently craters against good teams, their game craters against pressure, and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I compare him to Blaine Gabbert. Anyway, I think he's going to bust.
I like it. I mean, yeah, I could see the Giants taking Daniel Jones at 6 overall, and maybe that'll make you a happy man. Okay, let's move to a couple of listener questions here before we wrap it up. First one comes from JP Rocks. He says, ignoring landing spot, how high is too high to draft #TE1, TJH, and TE premium leagues? I assume this is a reference to you on Twitter being the president of the TJ Hawkinson bandwagon. It seems like that bandwagon is getting very, very crowded, Thor. Everybody is calling him Gronk. He can't miss. He's one of the best 5 players in the overall draft. I guess my question is, TJ Hawkinson is such a dominant blocker. Are we sure he's going to be used enough in the pass game to be that impactful in fantasy? Or is Noah Fant, who isn't as good of a blocker, who profiles much more as a pass catcher, going to be a better fantasy player?
That's interesting. I would say Hawkinson, to be honest with you. Hawkinson is a better receiver right now. Is Fant going to get better? Maybe, but Fant is a space player. Fant he doesn't make contested catches. He drops too many balls. He is not terribly effective in traffic. Obviously he's an absurdly good athlete, and so when he gets a step or whatever and the quarterback puts it on the money, he's coming down with it, or he can go up in the end zone and catch balls. He's a red zone killer and stuff like that. But yeah, in terms of stuff like that, he gets played down a little bit because he can't do stuff like that. Noah Fant never had 40 catches in one singular college season. Where at TJ Hawkinson, he was this blocking specialist before, in 2017, before he was great as a blocker. And so you sort of pigeonhole him as something like that, like in this class, for instance, like a Foster Moreau or something like that. Well, then Hawkinson comes in this season. And, I'm also an Iowa alum for people out there that don't know. I went to grad school there. So I cover all their games for work and stuff like that. And from week one, in September this year on, it was very clear TJ Hawkinson was the number one option in the passing game. And it was no fluke. The Ferences, of course, are quarterback whisperers. Brian, the son, who's now the offensive coordinator, he coached the tight ends for one season in New England. Back in the Gronk and Aaron Hernandez days and stuff like that. And they've sent all sorts of tight ends to the NFL. Well, they weaponized TJ Hawkinson this year, where, before it was just a blocking and a versatility, and the athleticism, stuff like that. This year, they weaponized him as a receiver as well. He's a guy who can play everywhere. He plays inline, plays in the slot. You can have him do H-back stuff like motioning around. You can put him at fullback, in short yardage situations, have him be the lead blocker. He can do all sorts of things. Any given play. I consider him an offensive chess piece, a guy that can move anywhere, do anything you want. He's always going to be adding value on every single play. And so the Ferences would basically build, like within plays, would build sort of scripts for TJ. Where it's like, okay, we need this guy blocked or like whatever, like, we'll run behind here, TJ, whatever. We'll throw to TJ, all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, he was at the forefront of everything. I think he's a sort of trump card on a play-to-play basis. And as a receiver, he's awesome, right? Like, last year, not in terms of counting stats, was he the top guy, but just in terms of, being the best receiver. He was the best receiver in the nation last year from the tight end position, won the Mackey Award. And usurped Fant as the number one receiver. Very athletic kid, which is something that he did not get credit for during the season. The foot speed is a little bit less. I think he tested at 4.7. It was a slower run. On the field, I think it's more like high 4.5 type speed. But where you really, really see the athleticism is like people like he's a good route runner. He gets the ball or whatever, turn up field. Very difficult to get down to, shuck a guy off him or whatever. Now he's running downfield. And you'd see the safeties, they basically try to do the kamikaze thing like they do with Gronk. They just run in and try to take out TJ's knees. And so you'd always see they'd always dive down. You'd see that moment in TJ's head where he's like, come on, pal, do the thing where you try to take out my knees. And so then they dive down, and Hawkinson every time would just go to the sky, just jump right over him and just keep running downfield. Just crazy athletic kid. And I think we've only started to see his ceiling. People say he sort of gets nitpicked as a 1-year wonder. Well, before that they were throwing to Fant, and Hawkinson had other things, that he was developing or whatever. And he clearly made that developmental leap. He clearly has the athleticism. And to me, he's the best blocking college tight end I've ever seen. I haven't been doing this forever. I'm sure, prior to, 5-10 years ago, maybe there was someone better. But for me, it's not even close. TJ Hawkinson's the only person that I have ever seen watching a live football game that has caused me to call a friend and say, did you just see that block? Incredible blocker, insane. If you have not seen his blocking clip on Twitter, find it. And I have one on my buy feed. Click the that hashtag that Adam was saying, the T1TJH hashtag. You'll see a whole bunch of stuff in there. But he had one block against Indiana this year that was just insane. He ragdolls this defensive end 15 yards downfield. In the process, they take out the middle linebacker, who has to run around him, runs himself out of the play. And then they wipe out one of the safeties when Hawkinson's ragdolling this guy into the third level. And what would have been like a negative 1-yard run turns into like a 12-yard run. There was just an alley that Hawkinson, wiping everybody out, created. I just think he is a next level, transcendent, generational type talent. I think he's the best tight end prospect to come into the league since Vernon Davis, in terms of that. And I do comp him to Rob Gronkowski.
Take it easy, Thor. We don't want you to ruin your pants here talking about TJ Hawkinson.
I love the kid. All
right. I don't know if you have an answer for this or you've thought about this, but Peter L. asked, in your opinion, what is the number one disconnect between NFL teams' draft strategy and college? In other words, what are NFL teams missing / not understanding, I guess, when it comes to how players are used or their production in college?
Yeah, well, okay. So I think the NFL is getting better at this. So I will say that in advance. But I think before it was this sort of fetishization of types, and so that would cause them to miss things. They would get these enormous blind spots because they had all these, but before it was much higher thresholds, for these specific things. And if you fell below, they cut you out. So I think a part of it was an enforced blind spot of their own sort of ideology. And I think the other thing is not baking in enough context And so the things that I'm talking about, with some of these guys like the Jones thing, although it seems like the NFL has with Jones, but say Metcalf on the other end of it, where you just sort of start to dream because of the profile, and you don't really think through the other things of like, well, why did AJ Brown catch more balls like every single season than DK had like his entire career?
Mm-hmm.
And AJ Brown could like line up everywhere, and he's also athletic, and and DK was pasted to the left side of the line, like stuff like that. I think they do miss some stuff like that, but they are getting a lot better. Baker Mayfield never would have been the first pick 20 years ago. Kyler Murray probably wouldn't have even gotten drafted 20 years ago. So they are moving in the correct direction. But I'd say some of that I would like to see them incorporate the more holistic approach.
Yeah, and I'd say one thing that Josh Norris has talked about a lot is where they win, right? And like NFL teams used to be like, well, this guy can really rush the passer, but he can't defend the run, or he can't drop back in coverage, so he's not a top 5 pick. Now, I mean, if you have one skill, and yeah, you're not that versatile, if you can really rush the passer, I mean, you can be a top 10 pick easily, even if the rest of your profile isn't that great. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, just understanding where guys win and asking them to do that at the NFL level, not asking them to do something that maybe they're not good at. And if you with the right scheme and coaching, I think you can get there. All right, I don't know where this last question came from. This is totally out of left field. From M3 Recat, he says, what is the ceiling and floor in terms of where Hunter Renfrow can be drafted? Maybe this is actually Hunter Renfrow's mom or something like that. looking for a take here, Thor. Do you have any takes at all on Hunter Renfrow's profile and where he'll go?
Yeah, well, he's definitely going to go on day 3. Hunter Renfrow is not going to go undrafted. His hands are too good, and we saw him, we saw him especially in big spots, but over the last 4 years at Clemson, we saw him beat too many kids in the slot there. But yeah, I mean, I would have liked to see him test just a little bit better. I knew it wasn't going to be very good, but the 10th percentile, that kind of hurts. But yeah, I mean, I have him at wide receiver 18 just because I know he's going to be solid in the slot in the NFL. But to answer that question, I would say probably mid to late day 3. And then I want to talk about another reader question that I think I missed on before with the Paris thing. I should have mentioned this before, as far as like the college ADOT, how well does the average depth of target, how well does that translate to the NFL or whatever? And so just to answer that quick with regards to Paris is ADOT hasn't been tracked long enough so that we have enough data to know how well it translates to the NFL. We're still kind of new, as far as that stat in college or whatever. And the other thing I would say, and I got this from Hayden, he's my math guy. Sometimes I feel like I'm the old guy, and I'm like, Hayden, I'm calling Hayden, like, how do I put things into the spreadsheet? And like, he was teaching me how to grab like that. I was like, I need the RAS scores, and he'd teach me how to like grab it. I was like, this is crazy, stuff like that. But he told me that the correlation between yards per reception in college and NFL yards per reception, it's about a 10% correlation, which is pretty low. So yeah, I just want to bring that up, with regards to Paris and the average depth of target thing while we had time.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah. I think, Paris is definitely interesting. Way more interesting than Hunter Renfrow. I don't know. M3 Recat. Don't waste our time anymore with Hunter, with Hunter Renfrow questions. All right, bud. All right. This has been awesome. Learned a ton. Thor, tell the people, where they can find you, where they can find your work, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Thorku. You can find all of our work at Roto-World on the NFL draft section. We have new columns every day. I'm right now, when I get off here, I'm going to be slotting my top 400. I'm done with all my position stuff, and I think we're going to put up safeties today, I'm pretty sure, which is the last position deep dive we have. But yeah, if you want scouting reports, background information, all these kids, they're spider webs. I have videos with the tweets with like videos of clips and stuff like that. Come and check out my deep dive series. And check out Hayden Winks' stuff, check out Mark's stuff, check out Josh's stuff. Like, we have a ton of draft content on Roto-World, so check us out.
All right. Really appreciate your time, Thor. Know it's a busy time. Enjoy the draft on Thursday. Don't get too excited when TJ Hawkinson gets drafted, bud. I'm worried about you having a heart attack or something. Take it easy.
I might be moving. If he goes to Buffalo, or if he goes to Jacksonville, like, a new fan base might have to embrace Thor.
Oh boy. All right. For Jerry, for Thor, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody. We are promoters at DraftKings and also avid fans. Our usernames are Adam Levitan, Al Smizzle, and CSU Ram 88. We may sometimes play on our personal accounts in the games that we offer advice on. Although we have expressed our personal view on the games and strategies in this podcast, they do not necessarily reflect the views of DraftKings, and we also may deploy different players and strategies than what we recommended in this podcast.